In the bitter winter of 1872, something unspeakable was stalking the children of Boston's working-class neighborhoods. 7 small boys, ranging from ages 4 to 9, had been discovered beaten, tortured, and left for dead in the most brutal ways imaginable. Their small bodies bore wounds suggesting a level of calculated cruelty that defied explanation. What terrified the tight-knit community most wasn't just the savage nature of the attacks, but the growing, horrifying realization that their attacker was just a child himself. A 12-year-old boy with a distinctive milky white eye who would become known throughout New England as the Boy Torturer and the Red Devil. The Boston Globe would later describe the perpetrator as possessing a fish nature that seemed to derive pleasure from the suffering of innocents, while police struggled to comprehend how someone so young could orchestrate such systematic violence. What you're about to hear is the completely true story of Jesse Pomeroy, who would become the youngest person in Massachusetts history to be convicted of first-degree murder, and the horrifying chain of events that transformed an outcast child into what many consider America's first documented child serial killer. This case would challenge everything Victorian society believed about childhood innocence and force the legal system to confront questions it had never faced before. Before we continue with the story of Jesse Pomeroy and the terror he unleashed upon the working families of Boston, the story begins in the grimy industrial neighborhood of Charlestown, Massachusetts, where the constant hammering from the bustling naval yard provided a harsh soundtrack to the lives of families struggling to survive in post-Civil War America. November 29, 1859. The gas lamps flickered dimly in the modest Charlestown tenement as Ruth and Snowman Pomeroy held her newborn son Jesse for the first time, her heart breaking at what she saw reflected in the yellow light. A thick milky white film covered the entire pupil of his right eye. A rare birth defect that made the baby's gaze appear ghostly and deeply unsettling to anyone who looked upon him. The condition, known medically as leukoma, gave Jesse's eye the appearance of a clouded marble, lifeless and disturbing in its opacity. The winter wind rattled the thin windows of their cramped apartment as Thomas Jesse Pomeroy, a weathered Civil War veteran who had seen too much death on southern battlefields, took one look at his disfigured son and felt only disgust and revulsion. Thomas worked brutal 12-hour shifts at the Charlestown Naval Yard, his hands permanently stained with grease and his lungs filled with metal dust. But nothing in his hard life had prepared him for the sight of his own child's deformed face. From that moment forward, Jesse would never receive the love, acceptance, or basic human warmth that every child desperately needs to develop normally. Instead, he became the convenient target of his father's rage, a living reminder of something wrong and shameful within the Pomeroy bloodline. As Jesse grew from infant to toddler to young boy, his appearance became even more shocking and disturbing to those around him. The white film in his eye seemed to grow thicker and more pronounced with each passing year, giving him an otherworldly appearance that frightened other children and made adults cross themselves when they passed him on the street. Neighbors whispered that the boy looked touched by the devil, and mothers would pull their own children closer when Jesse walked by, his marble eye seeming to stare through them into some dark realm beyond human understanding. At the overcrowded Charlestown Public School, Jesse became the target of relentless, merciless bullying that went far beyond typical childhood teasing. Children would surround him in the schoolyard, pointing at his eye and chanting cruel rhymes about Marble Boy and the Devil's Child. They would throw rocks at him, spit on him, and exclude him from every game and activity. Teachers, overwhelmed with large classes and limited resources, did little to intervene, viewing Jesse as a disturbing oddity best ignored. One teacher would later describe him as peculiar, intractable, not necessarily bad, but impossible to understand or reach through normal educational methods. The isolation was profound and devastating. Jesse had no friends, no allies, no one who showed him kindness or acceptance. He would spend his lunch periods alone, hiding behind the school building, reading and rereading the violent dime novels that had become his only escape from reality. These cheap publications flooding the market in the post-war era were filled with graphic depictions of frontier violence, torture, scalping, and brutal savagery between settlers and Native Americans. What most children would read as thrilling adventure stories, Jesse studied with the intensity of a scholar, memorizing every detail of torture methods and violence described in their lurid pages. But it was within the walls of the Pomeroy home where Jesse's real torment began, a systematic campaign of abuse that would shape him into something monstrous. Thomas Pomeroy had developed a ritualistic, almost ceremonial way of punishing his younger son that went far beyond simple corporal punishment. In a dank woodshed behind their modest Charlestown home, surrounded by the smell of rotting wood and rusted tools, Jesse would be forced to strip completely naked while his father prepared for the beating. Thomas would select either a leather horsewhip or a thick belt, testing its weight in his hands while Jesse stood trembling in the cold. The beatings were methodical, designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Thomas would strike Jesse's bare skin until blood ran down his small body, all while berating him for his appearance, his behavior, his very existence. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical pain, a deliberate, sustained attempt to break the boy's spirit entirely and convince him that he was fundamentally worthless and undeserving of love or compassion. Jesse's older brother, Charles, 17 months his senior, wanted absolutely nothing to do with him and treated him as if he were invisible. Charles was everything Jesse wasn't: handsome, normal, socially accepted, able to charm the local girls and fit in seamlessly with his peers. To Charles, Jesse was not just an embarrassment, but a constant reminder of something dark and shameful within their family bloodline. The brothers shared a bedroom, but Charles would often sleep on the kitchen floor rather than be in the same room as his disfigured younger brother. The only person in Jesse's increasingly isolated world who showed him any semblance of understanding was his mother, Ruth Ann. But even her love was complicated, misguided, and ultimately enabling. When neighborhood children complained that Jesse had been torturing local cats, stabbing them to death with kitchen knives and throwing their bloody corpses into the Mystic River, Ruth Ann convinced herself it was merely a sign of his sadness and loneliness, not the clear warning sign of something far more sinister developing within her son's damaged psyche. Ruth Ann would sit by Jesse's bedside after particularly brutal beatings from his father, gently cleaning his wounds while whispering that the world simply didn't understand him, that he was special and different in ways others couldn't appreciate. She fed his growing sense of victimhood while simultaneously shielding him from any real consequences for his increasingly disturbing behavior. When teachers complained about Jesse's inability to connect with other students or his strange fascination with violent stories, Ruth Ann dismissed their concerns as prejudice against her son's physical appearance. As Jesse entered his 12th year, something fundamental and irreversible began to shift inside him. The accumulated years of abuse, isolation, humiliation, and rejection had transformed his pain into something else entirely, a burning, consuming need to make others suffer as he had suffered. But in his twisted logic, Jesse's victims wouldn't be the strong who had tormented him throughout his short life. They would be the weak, the small, the innocent, children even more vulnerable than he had been. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Jesse began to study his younger victims with the same intensity he had once reserved for his dime novels. He would watch small children playing in the streets of Charlestown, noting their routines, their favorite spots, their vulnerabilities. He experimented with ways to gain their trust, practicing smiles and gentle words that felt foreign and unnatural coming from his lips. By the winter of 1871, when Jesse was 12 years old, the last vestiges of whatever conscience or empathy he might have possessed had been completely destroyed. The beatings, the isolation, the constant message that he was worthless and unwanted had created something that was no longer quite human, a predator wearing the face of a child, hungry for the kind of power and control that had been denied to him his entire life. December 26, 1871, Boxing Day. While most families in the Chelsea area were enjoying post-Christmas celebrations, sharing leftover turkey, and exchanging small gifts, 4-year-old William Payne was playing alone near his modest family home when he encountered a boy who would change his life forever. Jesse Pomeroy had spent weeks studying the child's habits, learning his daily routines, and planning the perfect moment to strike. Jesse approached little William with a carefully practiced smile, his pockets filled with penny candy and small toys he had stolen from local shops. He spoke in gentle, soothing tones that masked the darkness growing within him, promising the child wonderful adventures and special treats if he would just follow him to a secret place where they could play games together. William, innocent and trusting as only a 4-year-old could be, took Jesse's hand without hesitation. Jesse led his first victim through the winding streets of Chelsea to an abandoned outhouse on the desolate Powderhorn Hill, a location he had scouted carefully for its isolation and the impossibility of screams being heard by anyone who might intervene. The structure was rotting and forgotten, surrounded by dead weeds and discarded debris, the perfect setting for what Jesse had been planning for months. Once inside the dark, stinking outhouse, Jesse's carefully maintained facade of kindness evaporated completely. What happened next marked the beginning of one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history, as Jesse discovered something profoundly intoxicating about having complete and total control over another human being. Jesse forced little William to remove all of his clothes, relishing the child's confusion and growing fear as the temperature inside the outhouse was barely above freezing. He produced a length of rope he had brought specifically for this purpose, and tied William's small wrists together, then hoisted the naked child up to hang from the center beam of the outhouse ceiling. For what must have felt like hours to the terrified boy, Jesse beat him methodically with his fists and a piece of broken wood, savoring every cry, every plea for mercy, every sob of pain and confusion. The beating was systematic and deliberate, designed not just to inflict pain, but to create a sense of absolute helplessness in his victim. Jesse would pause between blows to study William's face, to watch the terror build in the child's eyes, to feel the rush of power that came from controlling every aspect of another person's experience. This was the first time in his entire life that Jesse had felt truly powerful, truly in control of his circumstances. But Jesse didn't kill William Payne. Not yet. Something inside him wasn't quite ready for that final irreversible step. Perhaps it was residual fear of consequences, or maybe some last fragment of restraint that hadn't yet been completely destroyed by his upbringing. Instead, he left the boy hanging there, semi-conscious and suffering from hypothermia, while he carefully collected his rope and any other evidence of his presence. William was discovered the next morning by searchers who had been looking for him all night, his small body blue from cold and covered in bruises, barely clinging to life. The attack sent shock waves through the tight-knit Chelsea community. But police had no leads, no witnesses, and no conceivable suspect. The idea that a child could be responsible for such calculated cruelty was simply beyond their comprehension. What law enforcement did have was a pattern that would soon become horrifyingly familiar: a young victim lured away from safety, extreme and methodical torture, and a perpetrator who seemed to vanish like smoke into the urban landscape of Greater Boston. The police assigned their most experienced detectives to the case, but they were operating under the assumption that they were hunting an adult predator, not a 12-year-old boy. Over the following months, 3 more young boys reported being lured to the same isolated location by an older boy with brown hair and a disturbing appearance. Each told variations of the same terrifying story, promises of treats and games, being led to the abandoned outhouse on Powder Horn Hill, and then experiencing acts of torture that left them physically and psychologically scarred for life. Jesse's methods were becoming more sophisticated and more sadistic with each attack. He was learning what created the most fear, what generated the most pain, what gave him the greatest sense of control and power. He would force his victims to strip naked in the freezing cold, then beat them with boards and pieces of metal he collected from the area around the outhouse. He began incorporating pins and needles into his torture sessions, sticking them into sensitive areas of his victims' bodies while studying their reactions with scientific curiosity. Most disturbingly, Jesse began incorporating sexual elements into his attacks, forcing children to perform acts while they cried, a ritual that gave him an intoxicating sense of dominance and control he had never experienced before. He would threaten to kill their families if they spoke out about what had happened, his distinctive marble white eye boring into theirs as he made promises of even worse suffering if they didn't keep his secrets. The local newspapers dubbed the unknown attacker the boy torturer, and the city of Chelsea posted a substantial $500 reward for information leading to his capture, an enormous sum that represented several months' wages for most working families. Parents began keeping their children indoors after dark, and those who had to send their children on errands did so only in groups with strict instructions never to talk to strangers. But it was Jesse's father who inadvertently escalated the violence to its final deadly phase. On July 20, 1872, just 2 days before Jesse would torture his last victim at Powder Horn Hill, Thomas Pomeroy discovered evidence of his son's increasingly disturbing behavior and delivered the most savage beating of Jesse's life. Using a leather horse whip in the woodshed behind their home, Thomas beat Jesse until he was unconscious, screaming that he wished his son had never been born. Something broke inside Jesse that night. Whatever final restraint had kept him from killing was finally and completely destroyed. As he lay bleeding on the floor of the woodshed, staring up at his father's rage-twisted face with his one good eye, Jesse made a decision that would damn him forever. The next child he took to Powder Horn Hill would not survive the experience. 2 days later, on July 22, 1872, 7-year-old Johnny Bork became Jesse's final victim at the Chelsea location. The torture was more brutal than anything that had come before. And while Johnny survived, the attack was so savage that police knew their perpetrator had crossed some crucial psychological threshold. Ruth and Pomeroy had been reading the newspaper accounts of the boy torturer with growing unease throughout the spring and summer of 1872. When she finally read the physical description published in the Boston Globe, a larger boy with brown hair and most distinctively a milky white eye that resembled a marble, her blood ran cold as recognition dawned. She knew beyond any doubt that she was reading about her own son. Rather than face the horrifying truth about what her son had become, Ruth and Pomeroy made a decision that would doom other innocent children to suffer and die. Without a word to authorities, without any attempt to get Jesse help or treatment, she quietly began making arrangements to move the family across the Charles River to South Boston, hoping that distance and a change of scenery would somehow cure her son of his violent impulses. The decision was driven by a combination of maternal denial, social shame, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jesse had become. Ruth had convinced herself that the attacks were somehow a result of the bullying and rejection her son had experienced in Chelsea, that removing him from that environment would somehow return him to normal childhood behavior. She refused to acknowledge that Jesse's actions represented something far more serious than acting out, that her son had become a predator who derived genuine pleasure from the suffering of innocent children. Thomas Pomeroy had already abandoned his family by this point, walking away from his wife and children without explanation or forwarding address. Whether his departure was motivated by shame over Jesse's behavior, fear of being associated with the crimes, or simply the culmination of years of unhappiness, his absence left Ruth and to deal with Jesse's growing darkness entirely alone. The move to South Boston in August 1872 was executed quietly and quickly, with Ruth and telling neighbors that she had found better work opportunities across the river. She rented a modest apartment on Broadway Street in a working-class neighborhood where Irish immigrants and native-born Americans lived side by side in tenement buildings that housed multiple families in cramped conditions. But evil doesn't simply disappear when you change addresses. And if anything, the move to South Boston seemed to embolden Jesse rather than cure him. He now understood that his mother would protect him, would help him escape consequences, would cover for him no matter what he did. This knowledge gave him a sense of security and confidence that made him even more dangerous than before. Jesse also understood that he was now in a new hunting ground where no one knew his reputation, where parents hadn't yet learned to fear the boy with the marble eye. South Boston offered him a fresh supply of potential victims and the opportunity to perfect his methods without the heightened vigilance that had developed in Chelsea. The escalation was immediate and terrifying. On August 17, 1872, just 2 weeks after the family's move, 7-year-old George Pratt was found tortured on the beaches of South Boston by local fishermen who had come to check their nets in the early morning hours. The attack was more savage than anything that had happened in Chelsea, as if Jesse was announcing his presence in his new hunting ground with a level of violence that defied comprehension. Jesse had not only beaten George with his fists and pieces of driftwood, but had literally taken chunks out of the child's cheek and buttocks with his teeth, leaving bite marks that would scar the boy for life. He had scratched George's skin with his fingernails until blood flowed freely and had stabbed him repeatedly with pins and needles he carried in his pocket specifically for torture purposes. The attack represented a new level of sadistic creativity and personal involvement in his victim's suffering. Where the Chelsea attacks had been brutal but somewhat impersonal, this assault showed Jesse beginning to incorporate his own body into the torture process, using his teeth and nails as weapons in addition to the implements he brought with him. Local police were baffled by the attack's savagery and had no idea they were dealing with the same perpetrator who had terrorized Chelsea. The lack of communication between jurisdictions in the 1870s meant that patterns weren't being recognized across municipal boundaries, giving Jesse a significant advantage in avoiding detection. The escalation continued with horrifying regularity. On September 11, 1872, 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy was lured away from his family's tenement to a vacant boathouse near the South Boston salt marshes. Jesse had spent days watching the boy's routine, learning when he walked alone to the corner store for his mother, identifying the perfect moment and location for an abduction. The boathouse was even more isolated than the Powder Horn Hill outhouse, surrounded by tall marsh grass that muffled sound and hidden from view by the geography of the shoreline. Jesse had prepared the location in advance, bringing rope, knives, and other implements he would need for what he had planned. Jesse slashed Joseph's face repeatedly with a pocket knife he had stolen from a local shop, creating wounds that would leave permanent scars. He forced the boy's head into the salt water of the marsh repeatedly, bringing him to the edge of drowning before pulling him back, savoring the child's terror and desperation. The near drowning became part of Jesse's torture repertoire, a way of creating the ultimate sense of helplessness in his victims. Just 6 days later, on September 17, railway workers walking along the Hartford and Erie railroad tracks discovered 5-year-old Robert Gould tied to a telegraph post near the rail line. The boy had been beaten and slashed with a knife, and Jesse had attempted to cut his throat before being startled by the approaching sound of footsteps and fleeing the scene. This near miss represented the closest Jesse had yet come to committing murder, and it demonstrated that he was rapidly losing whatever restraint had previously kept him from killing his victims. The attempted throat slashing showed clear homicidal intent, and only chance had prevented Robert Gould from becoming Jesse's first murder victim. But Jesse had made a critical mistake in his attack on Robert Gould. The 5-year-old was able to give police a detailed and accurate description of his attacker, including the distinctive milky white eye that resembled a marble. For the first time, law enforcement had a clear physical description of the monster they were hunting, and the distinctive nature of Jesse's eye defect made him easily identifiable. Police immediately began searching South Boston for a boy matching Robert Gould's description, but their efforts were hampered by the sheer number of children in the crowded neighborhood and the fact that most residents were suspicious of law enforcement. The Irish immigrant community in particular had reasons to distrust police and were reluctant to cooperate with investigations. Jesse, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly reckless and confident. The knowledge that his mother would protect him, combined with the intoxicating sense of power he derived from his attacks, made him feel almost invulnerable. He began taking greater risks, staying longer with his victims and leaving more evidence behind. On September 20, 1872, Jesse Pomeroy made the single most fateful decision of his young life. Walking past South Boston's Police Station 6 on his way home from one of his scouting expeditions, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to peer through the window to see what was happening inside the building. The sight that greeted him should have sent him running. Inside the station, 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy was sitting with police officers, carefully describing his attacker and providing details about the torture he had endured at the boathouse. But instead of fleeing, Jesse was drawn to watch the proceedings, fascinated by seeing one of his victims in the aftermath of their encounter. The moment Joseph Kennedy saw those horrible white eyes staring through the window, he began screaming and pointing with such terror that every officer in the station immediately understood what was happening. "That's him. That's the boy who hurt me. That's the marble eye," the child shrieked, his small body shaking with remembered trauma. Officers rushed outside and surrounded 13-year-old Jesse Pomeroy before he could react or attempt to flee. When confronted with Joseph Kennedy's identification and asked directly about the attacks, Jesse didn't attempt to deny his involvement or claim innocence. Instead, he readily and calmly confessed to being the boy torturer, showing no emotion, no remorse, no apparent understanding of the gravity of his crimes. One by one, his other surviving victims were brought to the police station to identify him, and each pointed to that unmistakable white eye with terror and certainty. The pattern of attacks across both Chelsea and South Boston became clear, and police realized they had been hunting not an adult predator, but a child whose capacity for evil exceeded anything in their experience. On September 21, 1872, Jesse appeared before juvenile court judge William G. Forsyth in a courtroom packed with horrified parents and community members who wanted to see the face of the monster who had terrorized their children. The press coverage was extensive, with reporters from Boston's major newspapers documenting every detail of the proceedings. Jesse stood before the judge with complete composure, showing no signs of fear, shame, or remorse as he methodically confessed to each attack. His detailed descriptions of the torture he had inflicted were delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that chilled everyone present and demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for his victim's suffering. Judge Forsyth, faced with crimes unlike anything he had encountered in his judicial career, sentenced Jesse to 6 years at the State Reform School for Boys in Westboro, Massachusetts, the maximum sentence available for a juvenile offender. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that the boy torturer had been caught and locked away where he could no longer harm their children. But they couldn't have been more wrong. The institutional response to Jesse's crimes was based on the assumption that he was a troubled child who could be reformed through proper guidance and education. No one understood that they were dealing with something far more dangerous, a genuinely evil individual whose capacity for violence would only grow with time and opportunity. The State Reform School at Westboro was designed to rehabilitate juvenile offenders through a combination of education, religious instruction, and manual labor. The philosophy behind the institution was fundamentally optimistic, the belief that no child was beyond redemption if given proper guidance and moral instruction. Jesse Pomeroy understood the system's expectations perfectly and played his assigned role with consummate skill. He attended classes diligently, participated in religious services, and demonstrated what appeared to be genuine remorse for his past actions. Staff members noted his intelligence, his apparent eagerness to learn, and his model behavior throughout his incarceration. But it was all an elaborate performance carefully calculated to achieve exactly the result Jesse wanted. He had learned to tell people exactly what they wanted to hear, to mirror their expectations and beliefs, to appear reformed while maintaining the same dark impulses that had driven him to torture children. His time at Westboro taught him valuable lessons about manipulation and deception that would make him even more dangerous upon his release. Ruth Ann Pomeroy, meanwhile, had no intention of allowing her son to serve his full 6-year sentence. She began an immediate and sustained campaign to secure Jesse's early release, visiting him regularly and lobbying institutional officials about his progress and rehabilitation. She presented herself as a devoted mother whose son had been led astray by bad influences, but was now genuinely reformed and ready to return to society. Ruth Ann's efforts were aided by the Reform School's own institutional biases and limitations. Staff members genuinely believed in their ability to rehabilitate juvenile offenders and were predisposed to see signs of progress and improvement, even where none existed. Jesse's intelligence and apparent cooperation convinced them that he represented a success story for their methods. Through constant lobbying, pleading, and manipulation of the system, Ruth Ann managed to convince authorities that Jesse had been successfully rehabilitated by his time at the Reform School. Prison officials noted his model behavior, his academic progress, and his apparent remorse for his past crimes as evidence that institutional intervention had successfully addressed whatever problems had led to his violent behavior. In February 1874, after serving only 17 months of his 6-year sentence, 14-year-old Jesse Pomeroy was released on parole back to his mother's care in South Boston. The decision was based on the belief that Jesse had been fundamentally changed by his institutional experience and no longer posed a threat to community safety. Ruth Ann had used the time during Jesse's incarceration to establish herself in a new business, opening a small dressmaking shop at 327 Broadway Street. The shop served the working-class families of South Boston, providing basic alterations and simple clothing construction for customers who couldn't afford more expensive tailored goods. Jesse was put to work in the dress shop alongside his mother, while his brother Charles operated a small newspaper stand nearby. To neighbors and customers, they appeared to be a struggling but respectable family trying to make an honest living in the aftermath of personal tragedy and hardship. No one in the community was informed of Jesse's history or the crimes that had led to his incarceration. The family had effectively been allowed to start fresh with a clean slate and no warning to potential victims about the danger that had been introduced into their neighborhood. Jesse's hunger for violence had only grown during his months of forced restraint at Westboro. The institutional experience had taught him to be more careful, more cunning, and more skilled at deception. But it had done absolutely nothing to diminish his fundamental need to torture and dominate other human beings. If anything, the forced abstinence had intensified his cravings and made him more determined to satisfy them. He had been free for barely a month when the killing began, and this time there would be no survivors to identify him or testify about his crimes. Jesse Pomeroy was ready to graduate from torture to murder. March 18, 1874. The early spring morning was crisp and clear as 10-year-old Katie Curran prepared to leave her family's modest tenement apartment for what should have been a simple errand. She had been saving her pennies for weeks, carefully hoarding the small coins she earned by helping neighbors with household chores. And today she finally had enough money to buy a notebook for her school lessons. Katie was a bright, cheerful child who was beloved by everyone in her neighborhood. She had dark hair and sparkling eyes, and she approached life with the kind of innocent enthusiasm that made adults smile and remember their own childhoods. Her parents, Irish immigrants who had come to America seeking better opportunities for their children, had worked hard to provide Katie with educational opportunities they had never received. The notebook Katie wanted to buy represented more than just a school supply. It symbolized her family's aspirations and their belief in the power of education to lift them out of poverty. Katie had been excited about the purchase for days, planning how she would organize her lessons and practice her handwriting in the new book. Her route through South Boston took her past several shops and businesses, including Ruth and Pomeroy's small dressmaking establishment on Broadway Street. Katie had been to the shop before with her mother, and she knew Mrs. Pomeroy sold small notions and supplies in addition to her sewing services. Jesse was working behind the counter that morning, helping customers and organizing inventory while his mother worked in the back room on alterations. When Katie entered the shop, her bright smile and cheerful greeting triggered something dark and predatory within him that had been building for weeks since his release from Westboro. What happened next in that small dressmaking shop has never been fully revealed, as Jesse never provided complete details about Katie's final moments. But we know that she never walked out alive, never made it to any other shops on her planned route, and never returned home to show her parents the notebook she had been so excited to purchase. The specific method of Katie's murder remains unknown, but based on Jesse's later crimes and his established pattern of behavior, we can only imagine the terror and suffering she endured in her final moments. What we do know is that Jesse killed her somewhere within the confines of the shop, then faced the immediate problem of concealing evidence of his crime. Working quickly and methodically, Jesse carried Katie's body to the basement of the building and buried her remains in an ash heap, the accumulated debris from coal and wood fires that heated the building during Boston's harsh winters. The concealment was hasty and imperfect, but effective enough to prevent immediate discovery. When Katie failed to return home that evening, her family immediately organized search parties throughout South Boston. The tight-knit Irish immigrant community rallied together, with dozens of neighbors joining the desperate hunt for the missing girl. They checked every alley, every basement, every abandoned building, every possible hiding place where a lost or injured child might be found. Police were notified and began their own investigation, systematically visiting every shop and business Katie might have patronized during her planned shopping trip. When they reached Ruth and Pomeroy's dressmaking shop, both Jesse and his mother were interviewed about their interactions with the missing girl. Jesse displayed remarkable composure and cunning during the police questioning, calmly explaining that Katie had indeed visited the shop earlier that day. He claimed she had purchased some small notions for her mother, paid for her items, and left the shop without incident. His story was plausible, detailed, and delivered with just the right amount of concern for the missing child. Ruth corroborated her son's account completely, telling police that she had been working in the back room, but had observed Katie's visit and could confirm that the girl had left the shop safely. When officers asked to search the premises, both mother and son readily agreed, confident that Katie's hastily concealed remains would not be discovered during a cursory inspection. The police search was thorough but not exhaustive, focusing primarily on areas where a living child might be hiding or where obvious evidence of foul play might be visible. They examined the main floor of the shop, the back workroom, and even ventured into the basement. But the ash heap where Katie's body lay buried appeared to be nothing more than accumulated household debris. Jesse watched the search with apparent concern and helpfulness, even suggesting areas where officers might look and expressing hope that Katie would be found safe. His performance was so convincing that police left the shop with no suspicions about the Pomeroy family's involvement in the girl's disappearance. But Katie's body was there all along, decomposing just feet below where police officers stood, asking their questions and conducting their search. Jesse had successfully committed his first murder and concealed the evidence, at least temporarily, while maintaining the facade of an innocent teenager concerned about a missing neighbor. The success of his deception filled Jesse with confidence and a sense of invulnerability that would prove to be his downfall. He had killed a child, hidden the body, lied to police, and walked away without consequences. In his twisted logic, this success proved that he was smarter than the authorities and could continue killing without being caught. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in South Boston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. 5 weeks after Katie Curran's disappearance, Jesse's bloodlust had reached a fever pitch that demanded satisfaction. The successful concealment of his first murder had given him a dangerous confidence, but it had also awakened an even more powerful craving for violence and control. This time, he wouldn't be content with a quick kill in the confines of his mother's shop. This time he wanted to savor every moment of his victim's terror and pain, to indulge in the kind of prolonged torture that had been impossible during Katie's murder. Jesse had been stalking potential victims for days, studying their routines, and identifying the perfect opportunity for his next attack. He had learned valuable lessons from his previous crimes about timing, location, and the importance of avoiding witnesses, and he was ready to apply that knowledge to create the ultimate expression of his sadistic impulses. April 22, 1874. The spring afternoon was warm and pleasant as 4-year-old Horace Millen played near his family's cramped tenement building in South Boston. Horace was a beautiful child with golden curls and bright blue eyes, the kind of angelic appearance that made strangers smile and comment on his sweetness. His parents, John and Leonora Millen, were desperately poor. John worked at Clark's cabinet factory for wages that barely kept the family fed, and they lived in a single room that housed their entire family. Despite their poverty, the Millens were devoted parents who cherished their young son and did everything possible to provide him with love and care. Horace was their pride and joy, a bright and affectionate child who brought happiness to everyone who knew him. When a bigger boy approached Horace that afternoon, the child felt no fear or suspicion. Jesse had perfected his approach over months of practice, using a gentle voice and friendly demeanor that put children at ease. He offered Horace candy and promised to show him something wonderful, something special that only good boys were allowed to see. Neighbors later reported seeing the toddler walking away hand in hand with his killer, completely trusting, completely innocent of what was about to happen to him. The sight would haunt those witnesses for the rest of their lives, the image of a beautiful, innocent child being led to slaughter by someone who appeared to be just another neighborhood boy. Jesse led little Horace through the winding streets of South Boston to the isolated marshes of Dorchester Bay, a desolate area where the city gave way to saltwater and tall grass. It was a location Jesse had scouted carefully for its complete isolation, a place where screams wouldn't be heard and where he could take all the time he needed to satisfy his twisted desires. The walk to the marshes took nearly an hour, during which Jesse maintained his facade of kindness and excitement, continuing to promise Horace wonderful surprises and special treats. The 4-year-old chattered happily during the journey, completely unaware that he was walking toward his own death with the person who intended to kill him. Once they reached the isolated marsh area, far from any possibility of rescue or intervention, Jesse's carefully maintained mask of humanity finally dropped completely. What he did to 4-year-old Horace Millen over the next several hours represents one of the most savage and depraved murders in American criminal history, an act of violence so extreme that it challenged contemporary understanding of human nature itself. Jesse began by forcing Horace to remove all of his clothing, leaving the small child naked and shivering in the cool April air. The stripping was both practical, eliminating evidence that might connect Jesse to the crime, and psychological, creating the ultimate sense of vulnerability and helplessness in his victim. What followed was a systematic campaign of torture that demonstrated Jesse's complete lack of human empathy and his genuine enjoyment of inflicting suffering. Using a knife he had brought specifically for this purpose, Jesse began carving deliberate X patterns across Horace's small body, creating dozens of precise wounds that maximized pain while avoiding immediately fatal injuries. The torture was methodical and prolonged, designed to create the maximum possible suffering while keeping his victim conscious and aware. Jesse took particular pleasure in watching Horace's face during the attacks, studying the child's expressions of pain and terror with scientific curiosity. In a final act of unspeakable cruelty, Jesse slashed Horace's throat from ear to ear with such savage force that he nearly decapitated the 4-year-old. But even after the child was dead, Jesse's rage wasn't satisfied. He gouged out one of Horace's eyes with a sharp object and mutilated the boy's genitals, acts that served no practical purpose, but satisfied some deep psychological need for complete domination and desecration. In his final desecration of the small corpse, Jesse set Horace's body on fire, charring the flesh and attempting to destroy evidence of his crime. The act represented not just practical considerations, but a symbolic destruction of innocence itself. At 3:45 that afternoon, two brothers named George and James Power were searching for clams on the beach when they stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a shallow pit near the water's edge, they found the mutilated remains of Horace Millen, and the sight was so horrific that both men immediately became physically ill. The level of violence was beyond anything either man had ever seen, beyond anything they could have imagined one human being inflicting upon another. The deliberate nature of the wounds, the obvious prolonged suffering, the sexual mutilation, all of it pointed to a killer whose depravity exceeded the bounds of normal human understanding. Word of the discovery spread quickly through South Boston, and within hours, a crowd of horrified residents had gathered at the scene. Many of those who saw Horace's remains would require medical attention for shock, and several fainted outright upon viewing the carnage. Police immediately suspected Jesse Pomeroy based on his known history of attacking children, his recent release from reform school, and the escalating pattern of violence that had characterized his previous crimes. But they needed concrete evidence linking him to this specific murder. And Jesse had been careful to avoid obvious mistakes. At 10 p.m. that night, police officers arrived at the Pomeroy home on Broadway Street with a search warrant and questions that would finally bring Jesse's reign of terror to an end. They found Jesse with fresh scratches covering his skin, defensive wounds from little Horace's desperate fight for life. His clothes were stained with blood that he had been unable to completely wash out. And when they examined his boots, the sole pattern matched perfectly with footprints found in the sand beside Horace's body. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Jesse was immediately arrested and taken to the Charles Street jail, where he initially maintained his innocence and claimed to have no knowledge of Horace's murder. For hours, Jesse sat in his cell at the Charles Street jail, maintaining his story of innocence while police assembled an increasingly damning case against him. The blood evidence, the footprint matches, the scratches on his skin, all of it pointed inexorably toward his guilt. But investigators wanted a confession to eliminate any possibility of doubt. The breakthrough came when police made the decision to confront Jesse directly with the full horror of what he had done. They transported him to the morgue where Horace Millen's mutilated body lay on a metal table covered by a white sheet that was stained with blood and other fluids. When the sheet was pulled back to reveal the full extent of the carnage Jesse had inflicted, even the hardened police officers present struggled to maintain their composure. But Jesse Pomeroy showed no emotion whatsoever. No shock, no remorse, no human feeling of any kind. He stared down at the destroyed body of the 4-year-old child with the same detached interest he might show when examining an insect. When asked directly if he had committed this unspeakable murder, Jesse replied with chilling calmness, "I suppose I did." The admission was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that sent chills through everyone present and demonstrated a complete absence of empathy for his victim's suffering. But Jesse wasn't finished confessing. In a moment that stunned investigators and would become part of criminal history, he went on to claim responsibility for the murders of 27 other children. The number was so staggering that police initially dismissed it as the boastful exaggeration of a disturbed teenager seeking attention. However, Jesse's knowledge of specific details about unsolved disappearances and his matter-of-fact delivery of the confession convinced investigators that at least some of his claims might be true. While the full extent of his crimes would never be definitively established, his confession led police to intensify their search for additional victims and evidence. The most immediate result of Jesse's expanded confession was a renewed search of Ruth and Pomeroy's dress shop and the surrounding premises. Armed with picks, shovels, and a new understanding of Jesse's capacity for deception, investigators began a systematic excavation of every possible hiding place on the property. On July 18, 1874, their persistence was rewarded when they uncovered the decomposed remains of Katie Curran in the basement ash heap, exactly where Jesse said they would find her. The discovery confirmed that Jesse had been living and working directly above his victim's grave for months, maintaining his facade of innocence while Katie's body rotted beneath his feet. The physical evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable. Jesse Pomeroy had confessed to multiple murders, and investigators had recovered the bodies of 2 confirmed victims along with clear forensic evidence linking him to both crimes. Ruth Ann Pomeroy's attempts to protect her son had finally failed completely. The community's demand for justice was absolute and unforgiving. Jesse Pomeroy would stand trial for the murders of Katie Curran and Horace Millen, becoming the youngest person in Massachusetts history to face first-degree murder charges in adult court. December 9 and 10, 1874, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in Suffolk County became the stage for one of the most sensational and closely watched trials in American legal history. The defendant was a 15-year-old boy whose crimes had shocked not just Boston, but the entire nation, challenging fundamental assumptions about childhood, innocence, and the nature of evil itself. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with spectators, reporters, legal experts, and curious citizens who wanted to witness this unprecedented legal proceeding. Many had traveled from other states to observe the trial of the youngest person ever charged with first-degree murder in Massachusetts, and the press coverage was extensive and detailed. Jesse sat in the defendant's chair throughout the proceedings, that horrifying white eye scanning the packed courtroom with complete composure and no trace of emotion or remorse. He had grown taller during his months in jail awaiting trial, but his face still retained the soft features of adolescence, making the contrast between his youthful appearance and the savage brutality of his crimes even more disturbing to observers. The prosecution, led by the state's attorney general, faced the relatively straightforward task of presenting overwhelming evidence of Jesse's guilt. The case against him was methodical and devastating, built upon physical evidence, witness testimony, and Jesse's own detailed confessions. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about Jesse's escalating pattern of violence against children, beginning with his attacks in Chelsea and continuing through his murders in South Boston. The survivors of his earlier assaults, now older and still bearing physical and psychological scars from their encounters with Jesse, provided harrowing testimony about the torture they had endured. The physical evidence was presented in excruciating detail: the blood on Jesse's clothes that matched Horace Millen's blood type, the footprint evidence from the murder scene, the defensive wounds on Jesse's body that corresponded to his victim's desperate struggles for life. Each piece of evidence was methodically catalogued and explained, building an unassailable case for conviction. Most damning of all was Jesse's own confession, delivered with the same cold detachment he had shown throughout his crimes. When asked to explain his motives, Jesse claimed he didn't know why he had killed, that something had made him do it, an explanation that satisfied no one and only reinforced the impression that he was fundamentally different from normal human beings. Jesse's defense attorney, Charles Robinson, faced what was arguably an impossible task. How do you defend a client who has confessed to the most brutal murders anyone could imagine? How do you generate sympathy for someone whose crimes violated every principle of human decency? Robinson's strategy focused on Jesse's age and mental state, arguing that no child could be held fully responsible for such extreme acts of violence. He attempted to present evidence of Jesse's troubled upbringing, the abuse he had suffered at his father's hands, and the social isolation that had shaped his development. The defense also tried to argue that Jesse was legally insane at the time of his crimes, that his actions were so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior that they could only be explained by severe mental illness. Expert witnesses testified about Jesse's psychological state and the possible medical explanations for his violent behavior. But the insanity defense proved ineffective in the face of evidence that Jesse's crimes were carefully planned and executed, that he had shown clear awareness of right and wrong, and that he had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection and capture. His methodical approach to torture and murder demonstrated a level of calculation that undermined claims of insanity. The jury, composed of 12 men who represented the moral conscience of the community, listened to days of testimony with growing horror and disgust. They had looked into Jesse's cold, calculating eyes and seen something that transcended ordinary criminal behavior. They had seen what many believed to be pure evil in human form. On December 10, 1874, after deliberating for several hours while crowds gathered outside the courthouse, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. However, recognizing the unprecedented nature of prosecuting a child for such serious crimes, they added a formal recommendation for mercy due to Jesse's young age. Judge Horace Gray, faced with one of the most difficult sentencing decisions in legal history, pronounced the sentence that the law required, but that no one truly wanted to carry out: death by hanging. Jesse Pomeroy, at 15 years old, was sentenced to be executed for his crimes, becoming the youngest person ever condemned to death in Massachusetts. The sentence sent shockwaves through the legal community and the general public, forcing society to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, and the appropriate punishment for juvenile offenders, no matter how heinous their crimes. The prospect of executing a 15-year-old boy, regardless of his crimes, proved too much for the political leadership of Massachusetts to bear. Governor William Gaston, a man of deep religious conviction and moral principle, refused to sign Jesse's death warrant despite enormous public pressure to do so. 3 separate times the Massachusetts Governor's Council voted on Jesse's fate, and 3 times Governor Gaston refused to authorize the execution of a child. The legal system had found Jesse guilty and imposed the ultimate penalty, but the executive branch would not follow through with carrying out that sentence. The standoff continued for nearly 2 years, with Jesse sitting on death row while politicians, religious leaders, and legal experts debated the appropriate response to his crimes. Public opinion was deeply divided between those who demanded justice for his victims and those who believed that executing a child would make society no better than the monster they sought to punish. Finally, in August 1876, the Governor's Council took a third vote, this time conducted anonymously to allow members to vote their conscience without political consequences. By the narrowest possible margin, they voted to commute Jesse's sentence to life in prison in solitary confinement. On September 7, 1876, just 3 months before his 17th birthday, Jesse Pomeroy was locked in a small concrete cell at the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, the same neighborhood where he had been born and raised. He would remain in that cell, isolated from human contact and denied virtually all privileges, for the next 4 decades of his life. The solitary confinement was intended to be both punishment and protection, punishment for his crimes and protection for society from any possibility that he might escape or influence other prisoners. Jesse's cell was barely 6 feet by 8 feet, furnished only with a narrow cot, a bucket for waste, and a small shelf for the few personal items he was allowed to possess. But even behind bars and locked in isolation, Jesse's violent nature and criminal intelligence never diminished. Over the years, he made more than a dozen serious escape attempts, each more elaborate and ingenious than the last. Prison wardens repeatedly found rope, steel pens, files, and improvised drills hidden in his cell or concealed on his person during routine searches. Jesse had an uncanny ability to fashion tools and weapons from the most unlikely materials, turning everyday items into instruments that could cut through metal, pick locks, or dig through stone. His escape attempts became legendary within the prison system, demonstrating a level of cunning and persistence that impressed even his jailers. In one particularly desperate and dangerous escape attempt, Jesse tried to destroy the wall of his cell by redirecting a gas pipe that fed the prison's lighting system. The resulting explosion not only failed to breach the wall, but cost Jesse his remaining eye, leaving him completely blind for the remainder of his life. Even blindness didn't diminish Jesse's determination to escape or his ability to cause problems for prison officials. He continued to plot and scheme, relying on his other senses and his remarkable memory to navigate his environment and identify opportunities for escape. During his decades in solitary confinement, Jesse demonstrated an intellectual capacity that was as remarkable as his criminal cunning. He taught himself to read and write in multiple foreign languages, including Hebrew, German, and French, using books provided by prison chaplains and educational volunteers. Jesse became an accomplished poet, writing verses that ranged from surprisingly beautiful to disturbingly dark, often reflecting on themes of isolation, punishment, and the nature of evil. He fought legal battles with prison officials over his right to have his poetry published, arguing that creative expression was a fundamental human right that couldn't be denied even to condemned prisoners. Most remarkably, Jesse taught himself law using legal texts from the prison library, becoming sufficiently knowledgeable to file his own appeals and petitions for clemency. For decades, he bombarded the courts with legal challenges to his conviction, parole applications, and requests for commutation of his sentence, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and constitutional principles. His legal writings were eloquent and persuasive, often impressing attorneys and judges with their technical competence and logical argumentation. But they also revealed Jesse's continued inability to accept responsibility for his crimes or show genuine remorse for the suffering he had caused. Prison psychiatrists who examined Jesse over the years consistently noted his remarkable intelligence, his complete lack of empathy, and his persistent belief that he had been wrongfully convicted or excessively punished. He never showed any understanding of why his victims' families might want him to remain imprisoned, or any recognition that his crimes had caused lasting trauma to survivors and entire communities. In 1917, after more than 40 years in solitary confinement, Jesse's sentence was finally commuted to allow him the privileges afforded to other life prisoners. The decision was based partly on his advanced age, he was now 58 years old, and partly on recognition that 40 years of isolation represented a form of punishment that many considered cruel and unusual. Jesse was transferred to the general prison population where he initially struggled to adapt to human contact after decades of isolation. But he gradually adjusted to his changed circumstances, even participating in prison programs and appearing in the annual minstrel shows that entertained inmates and visitors. The transition to general population revealed aspects of Jesse's personality that had been hidden during his years of isolation. He could be charming and articulate when he chose to be, and he developed friendships with other long-term prisoners who respected his intelligence and legal knowledge. But those who knew his history remained wary of him, understanding that beneath his civilized facade lay the same dark impulses that had driven him to torture and murder children. Prison officials noted that he never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes, never showed empathy for his victims, and continued to view himself as the wronged party in his life story. In 1929, Jesse Pomeroy, now an elderly man of 70 years with failing health and complete blindness, was transferred to Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane. The boy who had terrorized Boston's children was finally dying. His body worn out by decades of imprisonment, but his mind still harboring the same twisted thoughts that had made him a killer. Jesse spent his final years in a hospital bed, cared for by medical staff who knew his history but treated him with professional compassion. He continued to write poetry and letters, maintaining correspondence with a small group of people who were fascinated by his case and his remarkable intellectual abilities. On September 29, 1932, Jesse Pomeroy died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. He had spent 58 years behind bars, longer than any other prisoner in American history at that time. His death was noted briefly in Boston newspapers, but the world had largely moved on from the horrors he had committed as a child. Jesse was buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery with no family members present and no religious services. The boy who had once terrorized an entire city died alone and largely forgotten, his name surviving only in legal textbooks and criminal history studies. But Jesse's legacy lived on in the most disturbing way possible. His case had established legal precedents for trying juvenile offenders as adults, had influenced discussions about the nature of evil and criminal responsibility, and had provided a template for understanding child killers who would emerge in later decades. The fundamental questions raised by Jesse's case remained unanswered and continue to challenge us today. What turns a child into a monster? Can evil be detected and prevented? Or is it an inherent part of human nature that emerges under certain conditions? How should society respond to juvenile offenders whose crimes exceed the bounds of normal understanding? Jesse Pomeroy's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for darkness that exists within human nature, the complex relationship between trauma and violence, and the limitations of our justice system when faced with crimes that challenge our fundamental assumptions about childhood and innocence. This mystery shows us that the capacity for evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, challenging everything we think we know about childhood, innocence, and the nature of human cruelty. Jesse Pomeroy remains one of history's most disturbing figures, a child whose crimes force society to confront the possibility that some individuals are simply born evil, beyond the reach of rehabilitation or redemption. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Jesse was born evil, or was he created by the circumstances of his tragic childhood? Was justice truly served by his lifelong imprisonment, or should society have found a different way to respond to such unprecedented crimes? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this chilling case. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.